number will be online, live stream. So we always. Good morning. I'm Dr. Terry Roselle, Chair of the Department of Bioethics and Flanagan Chair at the Center for Practical Bioethics. And this is Bioethics 2, a course, but it's also the first in an 8-lecture series that we're calling the Current Issues in Bioethics lecture series. And this is the kickoff lecture for 2016-2017. We have with us the class, the second-year class of KCU, College of Medicine. In addition to that, we have some guests from off-campus who are here, who have come for this lecture. In addition, we have some of you who are coming in online, and we welcome all of you, especially those of you who are guests. And we have a guest lecturer, Dr. Johnston, our interim dean of the College of Medicine. Where are you? Right here. Dr. Johnston is going to introduce Dr. Daniel Webster.
Dr. Roselle, thank you very much. Again, I would echo everything in terms of welcoming, particularly the off-campus, off-site visitors to our campus. We encourage you to come back at any time, and also the online viewers that are watching us on the internet. It is a distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Webster. His CV is quite lengthy, so I'm going to highlight what I think are salient features that make him an authority in this topic. Dr. Webster is a Doctor of Science and also has a Master's in Public Health and is currently the Professor of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He also serves as the Director of Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research and the Co-Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for the Prevention of Youth Violence. He's one of the nation's leading experts on firearm policy and prevention of gun violence. He's published numerous articles on firearm policy, youth violence prevention, and the prevention of gun violence. We all know how frequent this problem is here in the United States. It is with sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Webster.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Chris? I'm going to use my, I'm mic'd up, I think. At least I hope I am. No problem. Hi, good morning. It's great to be here. Dean Johnston's introduction reminded me of a couple years ago. I was invited to give a talk in Little Rock at the Clinton School of Public Service. And before the talk, I had lunch with the dean, and we were just having small talk. And he said, "Hey, where are you from?" You know, I said, "Well, I'm from a little town in Kentucky." And somehow, you know, even though I work on guns and had done that for 25 years, I never really sort of got into kind of my own background. I said, yeah, you know, I grew up in a home with a gun. Granddad had guns too, and you know, I said something about, you know, shooting as a kid and stuff. And then when he goes to introduce me at this forum, and he had a bio that wasn't too different from what you read. I think he got a few words into the bio and put it aside. And he said, he talked about my Kentucky roots and my growing up with guns. And that was my credentials in Little Rock. But no, seriously, I learned a lesson from that experience. And something that is obvious, and actually I'm going to talk about some today, is how the cultural overlay of this issue. Many people probably had different assumptions about who I was and my background. One of my close associates, who's publishing a lot of research with us, is a gun owner, as is her husband. And so sometimes it's helpful just to sort of, you know, break that ice there. Like, you know, I don't hate all guns. I don't want to melt them all down and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, thank you again for the introduction. I'm giving actually 3 talks within this morning, later this evening, and then at the forum tomorrow. I don't know how many plan to attend all of them. There might be a little bit of repetition there. In my other talks, I'm going to go a little heavier on some of the research. I'm going to mention some research today, but the conversation I want to have today is focused more on what the title says, these cultural and political challenges that we face in addressing one of our most important public health and safety problems that we face in the United States. If you're going to solve a problem, particularly in some sort of collective fashion, in almost any aspect of public health, and you can probably extend it beyond public health for sure, much of this has to do with how are people defining a problem. Gun violence is a very heterogeneous phenomenon. There's all kinds of gun violence. There's all kinds of causes of gun violence. And there's all different perspectives that people bring to when they think about gun violence. A lot of people in the United States, when they think about gun violence, they think first about the mass shootings, the things that CNN and other outlets of that nature seem to, when there is such an event, it's 24/7 coverage. And so how are people, much of that conversation, and I'm one of the talking heads that they sometimes point to in talking about these issues. And there's a battle, in essence. Okay, how are we defining this problem? So for some people, the problem is mental illness, because some individuals who commit acts of mass shootings have some serious mental illness. Not as many as you think, actually. Some people actually, it almost seems as though the commission of an act of mass violence says that you are mentally ill. That's not true, at least not in formal terms as we think about mental illness. Particularly after the Newtown and the microscope in which people looked at Adam Lanza and his background, video games came up. I was on a panel of National Science Foundation formed shortly after Newtown to look at the phenomenon of youth and gun violence. And it was very intentionally structured with expertise to examine video games. So some people think this is a function of violent videos. More recent events, people think about mass shootings within the lens of terror, ISIS, these external threats that we might face. And of course, we all, it's sort of natural to think, gosh, you know, how horrible that must have been to be in whatever setting that occurred, that movie theater, that university setting, or whatever, wherever that, the nightclub setting that they were in. And what would you have done? You'd feel very helpless. So some people think, and there's a researcher named John Lott who first coined the term gun-free zones. And he has popularized the notion that the reason we have mass shootings in the United States is we have too many gun-free zones. That people, in essence, are sitting ducks because they can't have their guns ready, so that if someone were to try a rampage shooting, they could be addressed quickly. Of course, other people see these same phenomena, these mass shootings, and they immediately say, well, of course. We just have too many friggin' guns in the United States. We have roughly a gun for every person in the United States. We have a lot of guns in the United States. And so, so that's what many people immediately leap to. And then, particularly as it relates to this form of gun violence, we even think about, some think about, well, the capacity and nature of the weapons, like assault weapons, and how much ammo that they have. So there's a battle here in different lenses that people have. There's political and cultural factors that obviously affect these things. Another form of gun violence, one that I've spent really most of my time focused on, is urban gun violence. I work in Baltimore. I have for the past 24 years, and actually before that, did my doctoral training there. So I spent a lot of time in Baltimore, and Baltimore has a lot of gun violence, and particularly in pockets of concentrated disadvantage. If anyone would go to the Baltimore Sun and see comments that people make on stories where they're talking about acts of gun violence, you will see this battle occur, in essence, of how they are defining the problem. Some are saying, well, this is simply a problem of criminals, gangs, predatory people. Some will blame drugs. But really, the core of some of the arguments is there's something wrong with those people. Okay, there's a breakdown in the culture. They're in essence, a criminologist coined this term, subculture of violence. That is the reason that we have such problems in places like Baltimore and certain parts of Chicago and other cities, Kansas City, of course, being one. And then another group will, with a very different political leaning, will say, no, this is all due to the injustices in our society, the racism, the inequality and poverty. And then finally, some will say, yeah, maybe all of these are true, but what makes this particularly deadly phenomenon is the wide availability of guns. So there's, again, everybody's got their own lens to this, and it matters in terms of solutions that we bring forward. So why, let's get to the matter of guns, okay? The problem of mass shootings, the problem of urban gun violence. Why do some people immediately say, we've got a gun problem? And some people immediately reject that notion. I think, and this, I'm sure I'm drawing on my own background, is that for many people, they've grown up their whole lives in homes with guns. Their neighbors, their families have guns, and people aren't shooting each other. So there's a whole lot of guns out there, and people, generally speaking, aren't using those guns to shoot anybody. So how could it be guns if we have so many people who own guns safely in communities where, for the most part, gun violence is not a problem? So there's a disconnect here, right? It isn't in sync with their perceptions and their reality. But one important conclusion I think that people across the spectrum, political and cultural spectrum, come to when we just observe what we observe through the media. Again, thinking about whether it's mass shootings or urban violence. I believe we've been conditioned, literally conditioned, or wired, to believe that dangerous people are always going to be able to get guns, right? Because it's confirmed to us almost every day. We pick up a newspaper, go online, turn on CNN, we'll find some gun violence, I bet. Pretty good bet. A lot of times, multiple incidents. So we then learn people are always going to get guns. Why are we even having this conversation, basically? And then they'll come to either one of two conclusions as it relates to gun laws and gun policy, which is, well, if all these dangerous people are getting guns, it must mean that the gun laws we have don't work, right? But others sort of turn that on its head and say, well, yeah, it's because our gun laws really aren't strong enough. They're almost designed not to work. I can talk about that a little bit. So we have different realities and different conclusions that we draw. But I think that the problem that I see, that I face in my job as a researcher that's also trying to inform how people think about it and hopefully respond to the problem, I worry deeply about this, this notion that it's impossible to keep dangerous people from having guns. The only way that you can really examine those questions is through rigorous research. Because guess what? It doesn't appear in your newspaper or online when some gun policy, some act that the law enforcement are doing to keep guns out of the wrong hands, that doesn't show up in your newspaper. So-and-so didn't get shot today because such and such law was in place and enforced. Okay, we can't see that. The only way we do this is through research. And by the way, I'm involved in a study of Baltimore's underground gun market. Really one of the most fascinating things I've done. And there are colleagues in Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and soon in New York that are doing similar kinds of studies. And we're compiling a variety of kinds of data, but we're talking to different offenders, if you will, that participate or in some underground economies and what their perceptions are. It's a really fascinating thing to do because what you learn from that is that, yes, there may be a lot of guns in the United States, but what is in short supply is a trusted source of those guns. Okay? If you're a felon, you have to typically rely upon someone who is willing to give you a gun, transfer a gun to you, and someone that you would actually trust. And it turns out that that's not as easy as you might think, okay? If you think about some stranger comes up to you and says, hey, you want to buy a gun? You don't know that person. They may, you say, yeah, sure, I'd like to have a gun, here's the money. And then they point the gun at you and take your money and they're gone. Or worse, they shoot you, okay? Or they're an undercover cop. There's all kinds of these, or the gun doesn't work. or the gun's been used in another shooting, and then if I get caught with it, then I'm linked to a shooting. So all these things go in the heads of these consumers in this underground economy. And the bottom line is, yeah, there might be some guns out there, but that doesn't mean everybody who might be prone to misuse them can always get one that they want from a source that they trust, okay? So there's different kinds of research that are going to inform this general thing, general idea about this question of, can we actually keep guns from dangerous people? So there's all these forces at play that are very obvious that I just mention it, that inform and influence our cultural views and our perspectives on guns. Donald Trump, among others, is sending very ominous signs. You should be very afraid. Our country is going down the tubes. You're vulnerable to violent crime. You're vulnerable to ISIS. You're vulnerable in all these ways. And principally the way that, there's walls and other things that he has in mind. But he's also saying, really, it's about protecting your right to protect yourself, right? And this general notion works very well for people who sell guns, people who are part of membership societies like the National Rifle Association and other groups. But the other thing to be very afraid of is gun control, okay? The gun sales go through the roof after a mass shooting because typically that is when people are talking about regulatory measures. And so people, again, are convinced that Obama's coming after your guns. You better go stock up now. The other side of this, of course, they have their own spin on this. I think historically, they were more vulnerable to this idea that we're just going to blame guns. There's too many damn guns. I think some political forces and some Supreme Court decisions sort of have switched the script a bit. And now they are talking about regulations, but they're trying to sell a notion that we'll all be safe if we just have comprehensive background checks. Well, I think comprehensive background checks are important and a good idea, but they're not the panacea. They're not everything. So there's marketing and people externally trying to influence these. One thing I wanted to mention and discuss as we think about these issues, particularly in any context if you're trying to think about this through an ethical lens, bioethical lens, is the very complex relationship between guns, gun ownership, and violence, okay? I think among researchers, there's certain things that there's not consensus, okay? You have a lot of argument about. I think about the thing that you'll have least argument about is that guns are far, far, far more lethal than any other personal weapon. Yes, you can build bombs or other thing but that's generally sort of not how people, act violently. So it very greatly increases the lethality of any violence. As I was alluding to, there is a relatively low absolute risk. If you're a legal gun owner, okay, pretty low risk that you are going to use your gun that you acquired legally to hurt somebody, okay? But if you examine this as an epidemiologist and generally look at the relationship between gun ownership, whether it's at the individual or household level, with their case control studies of, and other ways to try to examine this relationship, you generally see a positive association. But that association, of course, in this, a lot of research confirms common sense, at least to some degree it does. And that is that the average gun owner, the average person bringing a gun into his or her home there is an elevated risk for the group, okay? Now, it's, in one study, it goes up 40%. In another study, it goes up almost threefold. But the pattern in the overall research that confirms common sense is, in essence, the more violent or risky your background is, the more that elevates that risk of you bringing in the home. And that, again, probably not very controversial. One thing that I often try to say, and it sort of takes people aback, is a lot of guns and gun policy is not controversial. Okay, so believe me, I'll get to this. Banning guns is incredibly controversial, but I'm talking about some other issues. For example, a male perpetrator of intimate partner violence, we've done studies that show that someone who is physically abusive and has the same characteristics without a gun versus with a gun, having the gun elevates lethality risk fivefold. Huge increase. People with histories of violent offending in their background, their risk compared to people without that background goes up as much as tenfold. So it's a huge difference. What about civilians' uses of guns? And I'm not talking about hunting and things. So civilian uses as they are relevant to personal safety questions. This is, there are many things that are hard to study in gun violence. Maybe among the most difficult is civilian defensive gun use, because it is so subjective. It's very subjective. Some people will easily conjure up, well, what does a defensive gun use look like? Okay, someone comes out of an alley and wants to rob me, and I have my gun and I use it, and okay, that I sort of get, right? A far more common scenario of civilian defensive gun use is there is some interpersonal dispute between two individuals. At some point, someone with a gun decides that it is justifiable to then pull out his or her gun in response to that. That person represents a threat to me, and so I am going to respond with using my gun in that confrontation. So the research says, you know, if we let people self-define, you tell us, did you use a gun in self-defense? So National Crime Victimization Survey, a little less than 1% of people who were victims of violent crime said, yes, in the commission, when a crime was being committed against me, I at least attempted to use a gun in response. David Hemingway and his colleagues recently published some research to say that if you look at the subset of all violent crimes and what victims do in response, that's how this National Crime Victimization Survey is structured. So they ask you, okay, once this act occurred, what did you do? I ran away, I screamed, I hit the person, or I pulled out a gun or a knife or whatever, okay? So there's a variety of things you can do. So what Hemingway found is there's really no advantage in terms of reducing risk of injury of the victim by using a gun when the crime was already in place. What they did not examine is, what about people who sort of anticipated, okay, something looks really scary here. I think so-and-so is going to do something to harm me. Before they do that, I will have my gun at the ready, right? And I will say, back off, I'll shoot or I'll do whatever, okay? Now that you can imagine really easily. But again, a lot of these things are incredibly subjective. If the same interaction happened with someone who is Caucasian, of the person you're evaluating their risk, versus African American, depending on how they're dressed, where you are, all these different things, you may make certain assumptions, that person means harm to me, okay? And so in another study that David Hemingway led, published back in 2000, he took respondents who said, yes, I used a gun in self-defense, And they just did a narrative. Tell us what happened. And they shared those with criminal court judges and said, basically, is this a legally justifiable use of a gun? And about half the time it wasn't. Okay? So if we would have interviewed the person on the other side of that gun, they may have said, that thing that person is saying defensive is no, he was hostile towards me. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is it's hard to measure, very subjective, but it seems quite likely that if guns are going to be most protective when they are used sort of proactively. And there's all sorts of ethical complications when you think about that more proactive, anticipating that someone means harm to you. Let's talk about civilian gun carrying and mass shootings, because this is a topic a lot of people talk about. And it's actually motivating a lot of policies, motivating policies relevant to this campus. Okay? There's a growing number of states, I think there are 3 now, that say they allow guns on college campuses, basically. And a growing number of states wanting to do that more, and I believe in Missouri similar things are brewing. And a lot of the motivation, not entirely, it has to do with we're going to protect ourselves against some mass shooting, rampage shooting kind of scenario. Well, there's a new book coming out by Louis Claravis on rampage shootings, where he goes into enormous detail about all the particulars of all these different events and the frequency, like what stopped these different mass shootings. And in very, very, very rare instances was it an armed civilian. And if it was an armed civilian, I think one of the times it was like a Marine, with a lot of training. But this general idea that just because you can get a concealed carry permit, which is really easy, that you can handle the stressful scenario of a mass shooting scenario and effectively neutralize that person and not put yourself or others at risk is a really big assumption there. Trained law enforcement who practice this stuff regularly often aren't so darn good at it. So I don't doubt that one could be trained to handle those situations fairly well, but I strongly suspect that the most people who can legally carry guns in Missouri or many other states probably aren't trained to that level to handle that kind of scenario. But more importantly, thinking about this in a public health context, is these are they're horrible, catastrophic events, obviously, but they're incredibly rare. If people are carrying guns around with them on a regular basis, whether it's on college campuses or into bars or other scenarios, what is far more common is the interpersonal conflicts, suicidal impulses, and other things, where having a gun can mean a big difference of what happens in the outcome of that, life or death outcomes. I'm going to talk a few minutes about right to carry laws. So in about 41 states, laws are in place that generally make it pretty easy if you want to carry a gun legally. If you can legally possess a gun under state and federal law, there's not many barriers to you getting that legally. Sometimes there's a permitting process, but generally it's not a very hard thing to do. And generally, actually most of the state laws require some safety tests, but is very minimal. None of them really require you to demonstrate that you could handle a host of scenarios that might you might encounter, that you might anticipate. This is why I'm getting a gun. You really aren't formally tested that you can do that. So here's sort of a conundrum or an ethical and policy question. So as a group, again, people who get concealed carry permits are very law-abiding. Generally, as a group, they do not present an unusual threat, okay? Many of them, frankly, demographically, are pretty similar to me. Middle-aged, white guys, married, living in suburban neighborhoods. And I'm not saying that demographic never commits acts of violence, they do, but generally, the environments that they're in and their situations tend to be not as risky as some others. But the troublesome thing is because our standards for legal gun ownership are surprisingly low, you can actually have a pretty serious history of violence and criminality and still legally own as many guns as you want and also carry them pretty much where you want. So there's a subset here of this overall low-risk group that aren't so low risk. And with them carrying a gun around, loaded gun around in public, does have far more implications for public safety. So you got a whole lot of people, low risk, and I've been at state houses when they're testifying on right to carry laws, and they come up and testify and they say, you know, I fought in such and such war, I've never been convicted of any crime, I'm an upstanding citizen, I should have a right to carry a gun. And it's hard to say, no, you can't. But there again, there's the sort of individual issues as opposed to what does this mean on a big scale, public scale. And generally what we find, this is a very simple graph, but there's far more complex research. But I wanted to just show a simple graph just for the point. So if you look at, in here you have states that never adopted a right to carry law and what their violent crime rates were in 1977 and what they were in 2012, a 38% drop. Now, the states that are adopting the right to carry laws over this same differential, they went down by 2%. That by itself, of course, is not an argument that right to carry laws do or don't affect violent crime, but there's far more complicated research on this question. Now, John Lott is someone who is often in the news and well-known and has conducted some research and published a book called More Guns, Less Crime. And he was the first to publish some of the research on right to carry laws, and that suggested that when states adopt these laws, their violent crime goes down significantly. But probably no area of gun policy has been examined as closely as this issue, and frankly, John Lott's research, and it's actually found to be have a number of very important flaws in this. It's easy, frankly, to get this stuff wrong. The more recent studies that correct for a lot of these flaws in either the data or methodology consistently now are showing that they are associated with higher levels of aggravated assaults. Aggravated assaults are assaults that occur with some degree of severe injury severity or with a lethal weapon. So while there was once a period 6-8 years ago where the research sort of suggested it doesn't seem to influence overall violent crime too much, the more recent data and research now shows, well, it looks like maybe it does. Okay. I'm going to fast forward through a couple of things because I want to hit some other areas and have a little bit of time for your questions and comments. I'm sure this is an issue a lot of people have thoughts about and questions about. I want to just sort of underscore this issue of the key issue of individual rights versus public safety conflicts. There's widely different views about what the Second Amendment means, how to interpret it. For all the years of our nation until 2008, there had not been a Supreme Court decision that had recognized an individual right to own guns. And that happened in the Heller versus District of Columbia case in 2008, where they overturned the district's ban, in essence, ban on gun ownership. They also had a similar ruling in 2010. This was a very important case for obvious reasons. But it's important to know that the justices did not say that because there is an individual right doesn't mean that you can regulate guns in reasonable ways in order for reasonable public safety goals. So there's a lot of, again, misunderstanding and about, anything that you might consider about regulating guns, whether it's a basic background check or something else. Oh, no, you can't do that because of the Second Amendment. Well, look, people are entitled to their own views about the Second Amendment, but really what matters is what judges, our Supreme Court, decide. So right now, they have interpreted, and there have been a number of challenges to a range of gun control laws since these decisions, recognizing the individual right. And by and large, these laws have withstood those challenges. Basic things with background checks, licensing, and those kinds of things. What I think, my own view, there were some gun control policies that you can more legitimately say, okay, now we're in the territory of rights. Something is, again, you can balance that right against the public safety, but you're in a territory, and I think as it relates to concealed carry laws, this is something that people might do on a very regular basis. And so, to me, you can have that discussion. Doesn't mean that, again, one individual's right to carry a gun trumps everything else with public safety. I don't think that's the case at all. But what I find particularly frustrating is most of the policies that are being discussed that I do research on that shows beneficial impacts really relate to inconveniences, okay? So how much can we inconvenience people to get some public safety benefit? And that really is, I think, what many of these things come down to, and I think to important questions. I'm going to run through a few data things really quickly and then open it up. I mentioned this before. Most policies are really not controversial, but banning guns are. So we've done national surveys in 2013 and 2015. I'm showing you the more recent data here from 2015. And when we put gun owners side by side to non-gunners in some of the key policy questions, basically about who should be able to legally possess a gun, there's pretty high, what you'll notice here is gun owners generally, well, I'm sorry, these are accountability policies. I may have gotten these out of order. This is what I was going to go to. So people with a temporary domestic violence restraining order, more than 3/4 gun owners said, nope, they shouldn't have a gun. Domestic violence misdemeanor, 76%, go on down. So you have pretty high levels of support that these folks really, I'd rather they not have a gun. And it's not too different from what non-gun owners say. It starts to diverge as it gets to multiple drunk driving offenses. It turns out people don't really a lot of people don't understand or appreciate this, but alcohol abuse and repeatedly getting drunk driving convictions really suggest you got a problem. It really elevates risk for violent behavior, but people don't recognize that. And then the general measures to accountability measures to keep guns out of the hands of the people that, again, they said they'd rather not have guns. You see pretty strong support across the board, not so much with safe storage laws, but most of these other laws that are designed to prevent that, vast majority of gunners are perfectly okay with. In our 2013 survey, we also broke this down with NRA membership. You got slightly less support, but generally, majority of NRA members even agree with many of these policies to strengthen our laws, with the justification we're trying to keep guns out of the wrong hands. Again, that sort of, to me, comes down to the common sense. There are certain people, probably all of us would prefer that they not have a gun in their hand, right? All right. Last bit of data I'm going to share is data that we haven't published yet, but we collected this year in a national sample, nationally representative sample of gun owners across the United States. What we find is that the vast majority say, nope, I don't sell guns to strangers. I would only sell to someone I know is actually legal, okay? So separating it from a policy question of just kind of a moral question, you know, is this an okay thing to do? Overwhelming majority say, nope, I don't do that. Those who will sell their guns to strangers very commonly take some measure to reassure themselves that that's not a prohibited person. Most common thing they'll ask for is actually a concealed carry permit that shows that you've at least passed a background check. Some actually do their own informal online searches as well. And many of them want to make this whole process easier. If they're at gun shows and they want to do an exchange with somebody, they would very much like it if they could very quickly have someone there who could run a background check for them and make that process easy. And most of them lock up their guns in a fairly secure way. So basically, I guess what I want to end this conversation, I had more that I prepared, this always happens, but basically to say that we've got some conflicts in culture and politics here that concern me deeply. And particularly, they concern me deeply some recent comments of Donald Trump as it relates to the Second Amendment people and what they might do if Hillary Clinton is elected. Very, very, very troubling to me. The silver lining is that the vast majority of gun owners, even though they might have cultural and different views about guns than people who don't have guns, generally want the same thing. They want the same thing. They want to keep guns from dangerous people. They're okay with some inconveniences for that. But if you can make it a little more convenient, they'd like it even more. So I'm going to see what questions and comments people have. Sure. Not everybody at once.
If Dr. Webster has opened it up for questions.
Yes, sir.
So,
Can you comment on what's done in Australia when they banned all guns in 1996?
can you repeat that, Dan?
Yeah, sure. The question is, what do you have to say about Australia and what they did with their gun control laws? So very briefly, many people don't fully appreciate this, but prior to 1996, when there was a horrific mass shooting in Australia, and they tightened their gun laws more, they already had pretty rigorous regulatory processes for to get a gun. It was very, very different from even it was stricter than any U.S. state law. If you went to New Jersey, for example, I think of as one of the strictest laws. Their laws were far more restrictive than that to begin with. But when they had this horrific mass shooting, they tightened those laws more. And one of the things they did is They ban semi-automatic long guns, and they actually had a buyback process to recover those guns. This would not happen in the United States for a whole bunch of reasons, okay? But it was sort of an interesting natural experiment, if you will, of what happened. They made these, what was so interesting is, even though a conservative, it was a conservative government when this act occurred, they sat down with all groups after that horrific event, and they pounded out some new regulations to prevent that. So since 1996, they have not had a mass shooting in Australia. Pretty phenomenal. They've also, there's evidence suggests that their suicide rate has declined significantly. It is debatable what impact it had on overall homicide rates. My own view of the data is it suggests that it did lower homicide rates. But I think more certain is they certainly eliminated mass shootings, and they made a huge dent in their suicide rates.
Other questions?
Yeah.
So, if the two perceived polarized camps are actually quite a bit closer to one another, as the data suggests, why is it that we continue to have this perception? Why is that perception? Is it the special interests that are driving that wedge to kind of maintain this?
So the question, just to summarize, is it appears that we have, this polarized gun debate, okay? Yet the survey data that I shows, people are a lot closer together on this than you might suggest. Why is that? What's that disconnect? And does it have to do with special interest politics? And I think that's precisely what it is. Or that's maybe the most important component. But I also think that there is a cultural component here. So those large majority of gun owners who said, yeah, I'm fine with background checks, I'm fine with this, that, and the other gun regulation, they're not necessarily comfortable with the people who are pushing stronger gun laws and how they're talking about it. And even sort of getting back to my first point I was making and how we're defining the problem, we've done focus groups with gun owners. It's really interesting. One of the themes was how offended they are when this whole conversation occurs following a mass shooting, and some people are saying it's the guns, because they take that literally personally. I'm a gun owner. I didn't cause a mass shooting. Why are you talking about guns? So even though they might be open to the policy ideas, there's a cultural comfort level that's not there, and the people who really kind of like the status quo with our weak gun laws really play to that. So there was a cover story in New York Times about a year ago about Mitch McConnell from my home state of Kentucky and how he went to Western Kentucky, and he talked about some of these issues. And what he would say is Barack Obama, Michael Bloomberg, different people pushing gun control, they don't understand you and your way of life, okay? It's sort of right in sync with some of the political dialogue we're seeing right now. And so you switch the conversation from let's have a rational conversation about how we have fewer people getting shot to now this is an assault on my way of life, on my culture. So I'm not going to, even though the ideas sound good when someone calls you on the phone or does an internet survey, you're not buying it because you're not trusting that, the voices there. So I think for us to move forward, we have to include gun owners in our conversations. We have to do that in a very respectful way. In public health and other spheres, people talk about cultural competence, and they typically talk about that as it relates to race, ethnicity, gender, and all these other issues, right? But there's a cultural competency issue when it comes to guns. And people who are wanting stronger gun laws for very good and legitimate reasons don't necessarily have that cultural competency. I don't know that I do. I'm trying to get there. But I think that that is an issue. So that maybe it's a longer response than you were looking for, but that's my own take on it.
Over here.
Can you talk for just a minute what it looks like for you to do research in the urban core in Baltimore? Like, do you interact with the people, or do you watch, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It turns out that I kind of look different from a lot of the community that I'm trying to collect data from, particularly if I'm going to more youthful for people. So I kind of learned that the hard way. We were doing a survey, actually wasn't on gun laws, it was on community prevention programs in some really, well, violent neighborhoods of East Baltimore. And I had teams out there collecting anonymous survey data from youth about their experiences as it relates to guns and violence and things. And I just wanted to make sure they were doing their job, and so I started to like watch them. No, people were like fled. They thought I was a cop or something like that. So I don't directly do some of these things myself. I train people to do that, and I always talk to people as close to the population that I'm studying as possible. One thing that's made that very convenient for me is Baltimore has a program called Safe Streets, where they hire mostly ex-offenders to go in and do outreach and violence interruption with gangs and other individuals. And I've learned a tremendous amount from those guys and developed some nice friendships with them. And so whenever I'm thinking about my data collection, I will often say, hey, this is what we're thinking, what's going to work best, run by wording, run by scenarios. They're going to translate best in that population. Another thing is, you know, make sure that what we are doing is always going to be respectful. I mean, we always have to think about IRB issues and not risk, you know, create risk for an individual. But to me, I want to go beyond that threshold. I want to make sure what we do and how we do it is very respectful.
Other questions?
These gentlemen?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. Dr. Rex Archer, Director of Health here in Kansas City, Missouri. And I guess the question I have is, to what degree, consciously or unconsciously, is the fact that fear sells, whether it's the media or weapons manufacturers that are actually driving our fear culture in the country, and that that's one of the root problems?
It absolutely is one of the root problems, and among the biggest challenges that we face. Some of my early work that I did in studying youth violence prevention, you know, I went into inner city schools in Washington, D.C., and there are these prevention programs trying to teach nonviolent conflict resolution. One of the things I learned from that is that, okay, you can have some skill uptake, and people will say, okay, yeah, this, I get that. But actually, acting on that behavior was so impeded by their understandable fear that if they get into some exchange with somebody, that they may be armed. And there is risk to, in essence, what the youth will tell you is, I have to be violent. I have to demonstrate that I'm ready to come with lethal force, because if I don't, I'm vulnerable. And I think that general mindset goes beyond that teenager in Washington, D.C., and goes, you know, particularly now when we're thinking about ISIS and mass shootings and all these other scenarios, it is clearly the biggest thing that biggest challenge that we have. And that's why I believe, you know, I chose public health for a reason, that public health looks at things from a population lens. And sometimes we have to do things, there's sort of a vaccine analogy. So we know at least many vaccines have enormous public health gain, but there are some individuals who aren't very comfortable with assuming that risk. of the vaccine. So I think it's somewhat similar when it comes to guns, is that we may convince people that, you know, generally having a little tighter lid on the guns is going to make us safer. If you yourself feel so vulnerable, then you won't sort of get on board with it. So it's undoubtedly among the biggest challenges.
One more question, then we're going to have to call it quits. Let me go to this gentleman back here.
I think you touched on it just a bit, but I was wondering if you could expand on it. So one of the more common counter arguments that I hear or see is it's not an issue with availability of guns, it's a mental health issue. I didn't know if you had done any research yourself or you know of any data out there that links access to mental health healthcare to gun violence.
So here's my response to that. I'm going to touch upon this in my talk this evening, but Jeff Swanson at Duke University is kind of the biggest authority in doing epidemiologic studies to answer the kind of question that you just posed. What he finds is somewhat similar to the ideas I've put forward before, which is certain people with acute mental health crises, yes, there are elevated risks for committing acts of violence, okay? When you think about this in terms of attributable risk, basically how much of violence, okay, could be attributed principally to serious mental illness, Jeff Swanson's analysis said 4%. So if you had something that was magical, you could just eliminate mental illness, wave your wand, okay? Interpersonal gun violence will go down about 4%. Okay? Some very important was suicide. Suicides outnumber homicides with guns 2 to 1. And addressing mental illness to reduce suicide, and particularly reducing access to firearms for that population, could have an enormous impact on gun mortality in the United States. So it's very perplexing to people in my world where people are putting everything in mental health, but it's sort of for the wrong problem. The mental health issue principally is a suicide question for the most part. Look, there are individuals based upon their mental health status should not have access to guns for public safety reasons as well. But we should not be under the illusion that we're going to solve all of this, but oh yeah, we'll just fix mental health as if that's really easy. It's not.
If you have any time tonight at 7 o'clock, you can come and hear the second lecture that Dr. Webster will be giving. It will be held at St. Joseph Medical Center in the community center area. And it's free and open to the public. There's a reception at 6 o'clock, lecture at 7. Tomorrow on this campus, over in Classroom B, in the Annex building, we'll be having at least 100 people from off campus coming in, but anyone on campus is welcome too, to join us for a symposium from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So Classroom B, if you have a few minutes, you're not in class, students, you want to pop in for just a little bit and stand in the back or whatever, come and join us. I want to thank Dr. Britt Johnson, who is the course director for this course, and Dr. Daniel Webster for his lecture.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm done.